The heavy thud of boots on asphalt echoed through the quiet, dimly lit parking lot of a suburban convenience store. General Alexandria Ford stood firm in her crisp, immaculately pressed U.S. Army uniform, her medals gleaming even in the faint light. Her sharp eyes were calm, but alert as she tried to explain herself to Officer Brad Turner, a stocky, red-faced cop whose anger was escalating by the second. "You don't get to tell me what to do," Turner snarled, stepping into her personal space. Spittle flew from his mouth as he jabbed a finger in her face. "You're just another one of them, playing dress-up like you own this place." General Ford clenched her fists, but remained composed. "Officer, I've already shown you my ID. I'm a United States Army general. Now, if you—" "Shut up," Turner barked, grabbing her arm roughly. He shoved her against the side of her car, a shiny black SUV with government plates. The move was sudden and violent, making her head hit the window with a dull thud. A gasp escaped her lips, and the world seemed to freeze for a moment. But then Turner did the unthinkable. He pulled out his baton, raising it threateningly as if preparing to strike. "You think you're better than me because of that uniform?" he shouted, his voice shaking with rage. "You think I care who you are?" Before he could bring the baton down, a crowd that had gathered nearby erupted in protests. Several people had their phones out, recording everything. General Ford, maintaining an iron grip on her composure despite the throbbing pain in her head, stared directly into Turner's eyes and said, her voice as cold as steel, "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Turner hesitated for a split second, his grip faltering. But the damage was done. What he didn't know, what would become painfully clear in a matter of hours, was that Alexandria Ford wasn't just any general. She had the connections and authority to destroy his career overnight. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their phones capturing every second of the shocking confrontation. But how did it come to this? Earlier that evening, General Ford had been on her way home from an exhausting day at the Pentagon. The meeting had dragged on longer than expected, filled with discussions about troop deployments and national security strategies. It was the kind of responsibility that weighed heavily on her shoulders, but she bore it with the grace and determination that had earned her the respect of everyone in her command. As she drove down the quiet streets of a small Maryland town, she decided to stop at a convenience store to pick up a bottle of water and a pack of gum. Simple comforts for the long drive ahead. The store was nearly empty, save for the clerk and a couple of teenagers browsing the candy aisle. Ford wasn't in the store for more than 5 minutes, but when she returned to her car, she found Officer Turner parked behind her, his patrol car's lights flashing. She frowned, confused. The parking lot was almost empty, and her car was parked perfectly within the lines. She walked over to Turner, who was leaning against his car with an air of smug authority. "Good evening, officer," she said politely. "Is there a problem?" Turner looked her up and down, his expression souring as he took in her uniform. He didn't respond right away, instead making a show of pulling out a notepad and scribbling something down. "You're parked too close to the curb," he said finally, his tone dripping with disdain. Ford glanced at her car, then back at Turner. "I don't believe I'm violating any parking regulations," she said calmly. "And even if I were, this is a minor issue. Is there something else I can help you with?" Her measured tone seemed to infuriate Turner. He straightened up and took a step closer. "Don't get smart with me, lady. Just because you're wearing that uniform doesn't mean you're above the law." Ford raised an eyebrow. "I'm not claiming to be above the law, but I do expect to be treated with respect." "Respect?" Turner laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "People like you don't deserve respect." Ford's patience, while vast, had its limits. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her military ID, holding it up for him to see. "I'm a U.S. Army general, officer. I think we both know who's out of line here." Turner barely glanced at the ID before sneering. "I don't care if you're the president. You don't talk to me like that." The situation escalated quickly from there. Turner demanded to see her driver's license and registration, even though she was standing outside the car. When she refused to comply with his increasingly absurd demands, such as emptying her purse on the hood of the car, his anger boiled over. He accused her of being uncooperative, then threatened to arrest her for obstruction. Ford remained calm, knowing that any sudden movements or raised voices could make things worse. But her calm demeanor only seemed to infuriate Turner further, leading to the explosive moment that would soon dominate headlines across the country. Back in the present, as the crowd's murmurs grew louder and the weight of the situation began to dawn on Turner, he took a step back. His hand trembled as he lowered the baton, but the damage was done. General Ford, still pressed against the car, met his gaze with a look that could cut through steel. "You're going to regret this," she said, her voice low and steady. The crowd erupted in cheers of support for her, and Turner's face turned pale. He glanced around, realizing too late that his actions had been witnessed and recorded by more people than he could count. But the night wasn't over yet. As the first sirens of approaching backup sounded in the distance, Ford straightened up and smoothed her uniform. She wasn't done fighting, not by a long shot. The sound of distant sirens filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. General Alexandria Ford stood tall, her composure intact despite the chaotic scene around her. Officer Turner, still gripping his baton, now looked visibly shaken. The crowd's voices grew louder as more people stopped to watch the spectacle, their phones pointed like accusing fingers. "Turner, I'd advise you to step back," Ford said calmly, her voice cutting through the noise. She was no longer speaking as someone who had just been assaulted, but as a leader who knew she held the upper hand. Turner hesitated, his pride battling with his growing fear. The man had always carried himself like an untouchable authority, used to exerting control over others, especially those he deemed beneath him. But now, he was starting to see the cracks in his armor. He wasn't dealing with just anyone. He was dealing with a U.S. Army general, one with power, influence, and an audience. "Backup's on the way," he muttered, as if that would somehow restore his crumbling confidence. "Good," Ford replied, her eyes narrowing. "That'll save me the trouble of making the call myself." The sirens grew deafening as 2 squad cars pulled into the parking lot. Out stepped 3 officers, their expressions turning from confusion to concern as they took in the scene. One of them, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, quickly approached Turner. "Brad, what's going on here?" the senior officer asked, his tone sharp. Turner gestured vaguely toward Ford. This woman was being uncooperative. She refused to comply when I asked for her ID. The senior officer turned to Ford, who was already holding out her military ID. He took it, his eyes widening as he read her name and rank. "General Ford," he said, his voice filled with respect. I had no idea." "You weren't meant to," Ford interrupted. Her tone was measured, but there was an edge to it. "This man attacked me without provocation, despite me identifying myself multiple times. I want this handled appropriately." The senior officer's face flushed with embarrassment as he turned back to Turner. "Brad, is this true?" Turner sputtered, his bravado gone. "She was being difficult. I thought she was faking it. You know how people try to—" "Enough!" the senior officer snapped. He looked furious now, his jaw tightening as he turned back to Ford. "General, I sincerely apologize for this. I assure you, we'll conduct a full investigation." "I'm sure you will," Ford said coldly. "But this isn't just going to be swept under the rug. I'll be contacting my legal team first thing in the morning, and I expect to see disciplinary action against Officer Turner before the week is over." The senior officer nodded, his demeanor respectful but tense. "Understood, ma'am." Ford stepped back, straightening her uniform. The crowd was still filming, murmurs of anger and indignation rippling through them. She scanned their faces, seeing not just witnesses but allies. These people had seen the truth, and they would ensure it couldn't be buried. She turned to the senior officer one last time. "I trust you'll escort me to my vehicle without further incident?" "Of course, ma'am," he said quickly, motioning for another officer to accompany her. Ford walked to her SUV with her head held high, her composure unshaken. As she climbed into the driver's seat, she glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Turner standing there, looking as though the ground had been pulled out from under him. But she wasn't finished. Not yet. The ride home was quiet, but Ford's mind was anything but. She replayed the events in her head, each detail sharper than the last. The arrogance in Turner's voice, the way his hand had gripped her arm like she was a common criminal, the baton raised, ready to strike. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. She glanced at it briefly, noting the flood of notifications from news outlets and social media platforms. The videos of the incident were already spreading like wildfire. Hashtag General Ford was trending, and her face was plastered across every screen. She sighed, her exhaustion catching up to her. Ford was no stranger to battles. She had spent her entire career breaking barriers, fighting for respect in a world that often underestimated her. But this was different. This was personal. When she finally pulled into the driveway of her modest suburban home, the weight of the evening hit her all at once. She sat in the car for a moment, letting out a long, shaky breath. Then she squared her shoulders and stepped out, ready to face whatever came next. The house was quiet, her family already asleep. Ford set her phone on the counter and poured herself a glass of water. She had just taken a sip when the phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from an unknown number. "Hello," she answered, her voice steady despite her fatigue. "General Ford," a deep voice said on the other end. "This is Secretary Jameson. I just saw the footage. Are you all right?" Ford straightened, surprised but not entirely shocked to hear from the Secretary of Defense. "I'm fine, sir. Thank you for checking in." "Fine isn't good enough," Jameson said, his tone firm. "This is unacceptable. That officer has no idea what kind of trouble he's in. I want you to know the administration has your back on this. We won't let it slide." "Thank you, sir," Ford said, her voice softening slightly. "I appreciate your support." "There's more," Jameson continued. "The president saw the footage, too. He wants to meet with you tomorrow morning. He's furious about what happened." Ford's breath caught for a moment. "Understood, sir. I'll be there." As she hung up, she felt a mix of emotions, anger, exhaustion, but also a quiet determination. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about sending a message that this kind of behavior would not be tolerated, no matter who the target was. The next morning, Ford arrived at the White House, her uniform as sharp as her resolve. She was ushered into the Oval Office, where President Reynolds greeted her with a firm handshake and a look of genuine concern. "General Ford," he said, motioning for her to sit. "I'm deeply sorry for what you went through. It's unacceptable, and we're going to make sure this never happens again." "Thank you, Mr. President," Ford said. "But actions speak louder than words." "They do," Reynolds agreed. "And you have my word that we're taking action. The DOJ will launch an investigation into systemic misconduct in that police department, and Officer Turner will face consequences." Ford nodded, but before she could respond, an aide entered the room, whispering something to the president. His expression darkened as he turned back to Ford. "General, it seems Turner has already been placed on administrative leave," Reynolds said. "But there's more. We've received word that he's contacted a lawyer and is claiming you were the aggressor." Ford's eyes narrowed. "Then he's not just a racist. He's a fool." The room fell silent for a moment, the tension thick. Ford leaned forward, her voice steady and unyielding. "Let him try," she said, "because I'm not just fighting for myself. I'm fighting for everyone who's ever been on the receiving end of this kind of abuse. And I intend to win." The president nodded, a determined look in his eyes. "You're not alone in this fight, General. Let's make sure he regrets every decision he made last night." Ford smiled faintly, knowing this was only the beginning of a battle that would shake the nation. But she was ready. She had faced greater enemies before and won. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as people filed into the gallery. Media cameras lined the outside, and reporters whispered into their microphones about the explosive case that had captured national attention. Inside, the tension was palpable. General Alexandria Ford sat at the plaintiff's table, her uniform sharp, her demeanor calm but resolute. She was flanked by her legal team, a group of seasoned attorneys who had taken on powerful institutions before. Across the aisle sat Officer Brad Turner, his face pale, his posture stiff, as his own lawyer whispered hurriedly in his ear. Turner had managed to delay the inevitable for weeks, using every legal loophole and public relations tactic available to him. But today, the trial had begun, and the evidence against him was damning. The videos, the eyewitness accounts, and General Ford's own testimony were a mountain he could not hope to climb. Yet, The mere fact that he was fighting this battle at all sent a clear message. He would not go down without a fight. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, entered the courtroom. The bailiff called for order, and everyone rose to their feet. The trial began with opening arguments, each side presenting their version of events. Turner's attorney painted a picture of a misunderstanding, claiming that Turner had acted out of fear for his safety. He attempted to twist the narrative, insinuating that Ford had been aggressive and uncooperative. Ford's attorney, Michael Greer, rose next. He was a tall man with a commanding presence, and his voice carried the weight of conviction as he addressed the court. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the defense will ask you to believe that my client, a highly decorated United States Army general with over 2 decades of service to her country, somehow posed a threat to an armed officer twice her size. They will ask you to ignore the videos, the eyewitness accounts, and the truth. But we're not here to rewrite history. We're here to seek justice. The courtroom was silent, the jury hanging on Greer's every word. Ford sat motionless, her face impassive but her eyes burning with determination. Weeks earlier, the first cracks in Turner's defense had begun to show. The video footage recorded by multiple bystanders had been submitted to the police department's Internal Affairs Unit, sparking a preliminary investigation. Turner's body camera footage, which he had conveniently forgotten to activate during the altercation, was another glaring issue. It became clear that his story didn't align with the physical evidence. Turner's police union had initially rallied behind him, issuing statements about his exemplary record and framing the incident as a stressful misunderstanding. But as public pressure mounted, the union began to distance itself. Protests erupted outside the police department, demanding accountability not just for Turner, but for the systemic issues that allowed officers like him to thrive unchecked. Ford, meanwhile, had used her platform to advocate for change. She appeared on national television, her calm but firm voice resonating with millions. "This isn't just about me," she said in one interview. "It's about every black woman who's been underestimated, every soldier who's faced discrimination, and every citizen who's been mistreated by those sworn to protect them." Her words ignited a movement. Across the country, people rallied behind her, sharing their own stories of injustice and demanding systemic reform. Ford found herself at the center of a national conversation, but she never lost sight of her goal: holding Turner accountable. Back in the courtroom, the prosecution called its first witness, a woman who had been in the parking lot the night of the incident. She was a middle-aged schoolteacher named Carla Jenkins, and her testimony was clear and unwavering. "I saw everything," Jenkins said, her voice steady. General Ford wasn't doing anything wrong. She was calm, respectful. That officer, he was out of control. He shoved her against her car, and when she tried to reason with him, he pulled out his baton. "I was terrified for her." Turner's attorney tried to discredit Jenkins, insinuating that she might have been too far away to see clearly or that her memory could be faulty. But Jenkins held her ground. "I know what I saw," she said firmly, "and I recorded it. You can see it for yourself." The courtroom murmured as the video was played for the jury. It showed Turner grabbing Ford's arm, slamming her against the car, and raising his baton as she calmly told him to stand down. The crowd's protests were audible, their voices filled with shock and outrage. Turner's attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The video was irrefutable. Later that day, Ford took the stand. The room fell silent as she recounted the events of that night. Her voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of emotion that made every word land with weight. "I've faced enemies overseas," she said, looking directly at the jury. "I've been in war zones where my life was on the line every day. But nothing prepared me for the humiliation and fear I felt that night. I was treated like a criminal for no reason other than the color of my skin." The defense attempted to rattle her, bringing up her position of power and insinuating that she might have used it to intimidate Turner. But Ford didn't falter. "My rank isn't a weapon," she said. "It's a responsibility. And that night, my responsibility was to stand up for myself and for everyone who's been treated unfairly. That's why I'm here." The jury seemed captivated by her testimony, their expressions shifting between anger and sympathy. Even the judge looked moved. As the day drew to a close, the defense called Turner to the stand. His demeanor was markedly different from the confident, aggressive man in the parking lot. Now, he looked nervous, his answers clipped and defensive. He claimed that Ford had been hostile and refused to comply, but his story fell apart under cross-examination. "Officer Turner," Greer said, his voice sharp, "if you were so concerned for your safety, why didn't you activate your body camera? Why didn't you call for backup before escalating the situation?" Turner stammered, unable to provide a coherent answer. The courtroom watched as his credibility crumbled. The day ended with a palpable shift in momentum. Turner's defense was unraveling, and the prosecution's case was stronger than ever. But the fight wasn't over yet. That night, as Ford sat in her hotel room, scrolling through messages of support on her phone, she received a call from Michael Greer. "General," he said, his tone cautious, "we've just been informed that Turner's legal team is planning to release a series of internal memos to the media. They're trying to shift the narrative, claiming that you've used your position to pressure the department." Ford sighed, her exhaustion evident. "Let them," she said. "I'm not hiding anything. If they want to play dirty, they'll only expose themselves further." Greer hesitated. "It's going to get uglier from here, ma'am. Are you ready for that?" Ford straightened, her resolve unwavering. "I've been ready my whole life. Let's finish this." The next morning, the headlines screamed chaos. "Officer accuses Army General of intimidation," one blared. "Leaked memos suggest power play in Ford case," another read. The narrative Turner's team had spun was clear. They were attempting to frame Ford as a bully who had used her influence to turn the public against him. The memos, which were snippets of internal communications from the police department, painted a vague and misleading picture, suggesting that high-ranking officials were being pressured to act against Turner for political reasons. The media frenzy was exactly what Turner's defense had hoped for. Morning talk shows debated whether Ford's status as a general gave her undue leverage, while social media became a battlefield of conflicting opinions. Hashtags like #JusticeForTurner began to surface, though they were quickly drowned out by the overwhelming support for Ford. Ford sat in the courtroom that day, calm and collected as always, but her attorneys could sense the weight pressing down on her. This wasn't just a battle for her reputation. It was a fight against a deeply ingrained system that always seemed to turn the tables on those who challenged it. Inside the courtroom, Turner's lawyer wasted no time leveraging the media storm. During cross-examination, he grilled Ford on her public statements. "General Ford," he began, his tone oozing with feigned politeness, "you've been quite vocal about this incident, haven't you? Appearing on television, giving interviews, even rallying public support. Do you think it's appropriate for someone in your position to influence public opinion during an ongoing investigation?" Ford didn't flinch. She met his gaze steadily. "I've spoken out because this is about more than just me," she said. "It's about accountability and justice. If my story encourages others to come forward, then I stand by every word I've said. But don't you think your position as a general gives you an unfair advantage?" he pressed. "You hold immense power and influence. Isn't it possible that you've used that to sway public perception?" Ford tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. "Power comes with responsibility," she replied, "and I've used mine responsibly to ensure the truth is heard. Officer Turner also holds power, but he used his to harm and intimidate. That's the real issue here." The courtroom murmured in approval, but Turner's lawyer wasn't done. He produced the leaked memos, holding them up dramatically. These memos suggest that the police department acted under pressure from powerful figures, perhaps even the military. "Can you honestly say you had no part in that?" Ford's attorney, Michael Greer, stood quickly. "Objection, Your Honor. The defense is attempting to introduce unverified documents into evidence." The judge frowned, her sharp gaze cutting across the room. "Sustained. Counselor, unless you can authenticate those memos, they hold no weight here." The defense attorney hesitated, then reluctantly moved on, but the damage had been done. The seeds of doubt had been planted. Outside the courtroom, the media circus raged on. Protesters gathered in droves, their signs and chants creating a cacophony of anger and hope. Some called for justice for Ford, while others, swayed by the defense's narrative, demanded a fair trial for Turner. News anchors speculated endlessly about what the memos might mean, fueling public curiosity and confusion. Ford watched from the courthouse steps as her security team escorted her to her car. The crowd was massive, their voices a mixture of support and vitriol. A young girl holding a sign that read, "We believe you, General Ford," caught her eye, and Ford paused for a moment, giving the girl a small, encouraging smile before stepping into the vehicle. "Do you ever wonder if it's worth it?" Greer asked as he climbed into the car beside her. Ford sighed, leaning back against the seat. "Every day. But giving up isn't an option." As the trial wore on, the defense continued to pull every trick they could think of. They called a character witness, an officer who had worked with Turner for years, and described him as dedicated and professional. The prosecution countered with evidence of Turner's prior complaints, instances of excessive force, discriminatory remarks, and abuse of authority. Though none had resulted in formal discipline, the pattern was undeniable. The turning point came when Ford's team called their final witness, Dr. Rebecca Nguyen, a forensic psychologist who specialized in police misconduct. "Dr. Nguyen," Greer began, "can you explain the psychology behind an officer's use of excessive force, particularly in situations involving individuals of color?" Dr. Nguyen nodded. "Studies have shown that implicit bias plays a significant role in law enforcement interactions. Officers with unchecked biases are more likely to perceive black individuals as threats, even in non-threatening situations. This often leads to escalations that could have been avoided with proper training and accountability." The courtroom was silent as she continued. "In the case of Officer Turner, the video evidence suggests an immediate escalation. General Ford was calm, cooperative, and clearly identified herself. Yet he chose to use force rather than de-escalate. This pattern aligns with documented cases of racial bias in policing." Turner shifted uncomfortably in his seat as the jury absorbed Dr. Nguyen's testimony. It was a damning blow to his defense. That evening, Ford returned to her hotel room to find her phone buzzing nonstop. Messages of support poured in, but so did threats and hateful comments from Turner's defenders. She ignored them, focusing instead on the task ahead. As she prepared for bed, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from Greer. "General," he said, his voice tense, "we just received word that Turner's team plans to introduce new evidence tomorrow. They claim to have a witness who'll corroborate his version of events." Ford frowned. "A witness? After all this time?" "Exactly," Greer said. "It's suspicious, but we need to be prepared. They're going to throw everything they have at us." Ford nodded, her jaw tightening. "Let them. We've come too far to let them win now." The next day, the courtroom was packed as Turner's team unveiled their star witness, a man named Chris Malloy, who claimed to have been in the parking lot that night. Malloy described a completely different version of events, painting Turner as a cautious officer who had been provoked by Ford's alleged hostility. The courtroom was tense as Malloy spun his tale, but Greer was ready. During cross-examination, he dismantled Malloy's credibility piece by piece, revealing inconsistencies in his story and connections to Turner that hadn't been disclosed. By the time Greer was finished, Malloy looked flustered and defensive. The defense's last-ditch effort had backfired spectacularly. As the trial entered its final days, the atmosphere was electric. The prosecution delivered a powerful closing argument, emphasizing the mountain of evidence against Turner and the importance of holding him accountable. The defense, desperate, tried to paint Turner as a victim of a media witch hunt, but their argument rang hollow. When the jury finally retired to deliberate, the nation held its breath. Ford sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, her expression calm, but her hands tightly clasped in her lap. Hours later, the jury returned. The courtroom fell silent as the foreperson stood, holding the verdict in trembling hands. On the charge of assault and misconduct under color of law, the foreperson said, her voice clear and steady, "We find the defendant, Officer Brad Turner, guilty." The room erupted into chaos. Cheers from Ford supporters, gasps from Turner's camp, and the flash of cameras capturing the historic moment. Ford closed her eyes, a wave of relief washing over her. But as she left the courtroom, surrounded by her team and the roar of the crowd, she knew this wasn't the end. The fight for justice was far from over, but she had taken the first, most important step, and she wasn't about to stop now. The roar of the crowd outside the courthouse was deafening. Supporters chanted General Ford's name, waving signs that read "Justice Won" and "Accountability for All." Media cameras jostled for position, capturing every angle of the historic verdict. Ford stepped outside, her chin high, her uniform gleaming in the afternoon sun. For a moment, she allowed herself a deep breath, the weight of the trial's outcome finally beginning to lift. Her legal team flanked her, forming a protective barrier as reporters shouted questions. Michael Greer raised a hand, signaling for silence, before turning to Ford. "General Ford will make a brief statement," he said, his voice authoritative. Ford stepped forward, her eyes scanning the sea of faces. The cameras zoomed in, her image filling television screens and social media feeds across the nation. "I stand here today not as an individual, but as a representative of countless others who have faced injustice," she began, her voice steady and resolute. "This verdict is a step forward, but it is not the end. True justice means systemic change, and I will continue to use my voice and my platform to demand accountability and reform." The crowd erupted in cheers, their applause echoing down the street. Ford took one last look at the faces before her, the young, the old, the hopeful, and turned to leave. But as she walked toward the waiting SUV, a figure pushed through the crowd, shouting above the din, "General Ford!" Ford paused, her bodyguard stepping closer in anticipation of trouble. A young black man, no older than 20, stood just a few feet away, his hands raised to show he meant no harm. He held a crumpled envelope in one hand. "My mom wanted you to have this," he said, his voice trembling. She says thank you for what you did." Ford motioned for the guards to let him approach. He handed her the envelope, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You saved lives today, ma'am," he said before disappearing back into the crowd. Ford climbed into the SUV, turning the envelope over in her hands. The words, "Thank you," were scrawled across it in shaky handwriting. She tucked it in her jacket pocket, knowing she'd read it later when the world was quieter. The weeks following the trial were a whirlwind. News outlets dissected every detail of the case, from the damning video footage to the surprise witness whose testimony had unraveled under cross-examination. The verdict against Turner sent ripples through the law enforcement community, sparking debates about police accountability and the role of systemic bias. Some departments began implementing immediate changes: mandatory bias training, stricter oversight, and increased transparency. Others resisted, claiming the trial was a political stunt. But Ford's voice remained steady, her message unwavering. This was only the beginning. Amidst the chaos, Ford returned to her duties at the Pentagon. She threw herself into her work, finding solace in the structure and purpose of her role. Yet, the trial's aftermath followed her everywhere. Invitations to speak at universities and conferences poured in. Advocacy groups reached out, eager to partner with her on reform initiatives. One evening, as she sat at her desk reviewing troop deployment plans, her assistant knocked on the door. "Ma'am, there's someone here to see you," the assistant said, hesitating. "It's Secretary Jameson." Ford frowned but nodded. "Send him in." Secretary of Defense William Jameson entered, his imposing frame filling the room. He was a no-nonsense man with a reputation for valuing results over appearances. But tonight, his face bore an unusual expression of concern. "General," he said, closing the door behind him, "we need to talk." Ford gestured to the chair opposite her desk. "What's this about, sir?" Jameson sat, folding his hands on the table. "Your case has sparked a national conversation, and that's a good thing. But it's also put a target on your back." Ford tilted her head. "A target?" Jameson leaned forward. "The law enforcement community is divided. Some support what you've done, but others, they see you as a threat. I've received intel about certain groups planning to discredit you, maybe worse." Ford's eyes narrowed. "Are you saying I'm in danger?" "Not immediate danger," Jameson said, choosing his words carefully. "But you need to be prepared. They're digging into your past, looking for anything they can use against you. We've already intercepted some chatter about fabricated stories and smear campaigns. Ford let out a slow breath, her mind racing. She had always known her fight for justice wouldn't come without consequences, but hearing it confirmed was another matter. I appreciate the warning, she said finally, but I won't let threats silence me. If anything, it strengthens my resolve. Jameson nodded, respect flickering in his eyes. I figured you'd say that. Just watch your back, General. This fight is far from over. The first attack came a week later. An anonymous article surfaced online, accusing Ford of misconduct during a training exercise years earlier. The story was flimsy, relying on vague sources and unsubstantiated claims, but it was enough to fuel conspiracy theories. Ford's team acted swiftly, releasing official records that disproved the allegations. Yet the damage was done. Social media lit up with debates, and Ford's detractors seized the moment to question her integrity. That evening, as Ford sat in her living room scrolling through the latest headlines, her phone buzzed with a call from Greer. "They're playing dirty now," he said, his frustration evident. "We're tracing the source of the article, but whoever's behind this is careful. They're trying to wear you down." Ford leaned back, her gaze fixed on the ceiling. "Let them try," she said. "I've been through worse." But even as she spoke the words, she couldn't shake the unease creeping into her mind. The battle she had won in the courtroom was only one skirmish in a much larger war. Her enemies were regrouping, and the next attack could come from anywhere. The next morning, Ford awoke to a new development. Her assistant, Laura, burst into her office with a stack of papers. "Ma'am, you need to see this," Laura said, her voice urgent. She handed Ford the documents, transcripts of leaked emails from the police union. Ford's eyes widened as she scanned the pages. The emails detailed a coordinated effort to undermine her, including plans to fund lawsuits against her and spread disinformation. "This is huge," Ford said, her mind racing. "How do we get these?" Laura hesitated. "An anonymous source sent them to our office this morning. No name, just a message. The truth matters." Ford stared at the papers, her pulse quickening. The emails were a smoking gun, proof that her enemies were orchestrating a campaign against her. But who was the anonymous source? And why had they chosen to help her? Before she could dwell on it, her phone buzzed with another notification. This time, it was a breaking news alert. Threats escalate against General Ford as police union scrambles to defend itself. Ford set the papers down, her resolve hardening. The storm was growing, but she was ready to face it. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about changing a system that had resisted change for far too long. As she prepared for the battles ahead, one thought echoed in her mind. They could attack her, discredit her, even threaten her, but they wouldn't break her. Not now. Not ever. The leaked emails sent shockwaves across the nation. Major news outlets dissected the revelations, airing segment after segment on the police union's coordinated effort to discredit General Alexandria Ford. The emails exposed not only smear tactics, but also an unsettling undercurrent of racism and sexism among certain key players. Phrases like "put her back in her place" and "make her regret stepping out of line" were splashed across headlines, triggering outrage from the public. Ford watched the fallout unfold with a mixture of grim satisfaction and exhaustion. She had expected resistance, but the depths of the animosity aimed at her were sobering. Still, there was no time to dwell on it. There was too much work to do. Her phone buzzed constantly as allies reached out to show support. Civil rights organizations, military officials, and even some prominent politicians rallied around her. But amidst the calls of encouragement came another warning. The situation was escalating. The following week, Ford found herself in a high-security briefing at the Pentagon. The room was packed with military officials, intelligence agents, and legal advisors. Secretary Jameson presided over the meeting, his expression grave. "General Ford," he began, addressing her directly, "we've identified the source of the leaked emails." Ford sat up straighter, her eyes narrowing. "Who was it?" Jameson exchanged a glance with one of the intelligence officers, who nodded before responding. "It was an insider," the officer said, "a mid-level clerk at the police union who claims they were disturbed by what they saw. They acted alone and sent the emails anonymously, but their identity has now been compromised." Ford frowned. Compromised how? Jameson leaned forward, his voice low. The union found out. The clerk is receiving threats and has gone into hiding. They're requesting federal protection. Ford's jaw tightened. The idea that someone had risked their safety to expose the truth and was now paying the price ignited a spark of anger within her. "We can't let them face this alone," she said. "If they're willing to stand up for what's right, we owe them our support." "Agreed," Jameson said. "We're coordinating with the DOJ to ensure their safety. But there's more." He tapped a folder in front of him. "We've intercepted chatter indicating that extremist groups are now targeting you specifically. They're angry about the trial, the emails, and the attention you're bringing to systemic issues." Ford's stomach tightened, but she kept her expression calm. "What kind of threats are we talking about?" Jameson hesitated before answering. "Credible ones. We're enhancing your security detail immediately. This is no longer just a smear campaign. It's becoming a national security concern." That night, Ford returned to her home under the watchful eyes of her expanded security team. The once quiet suburban street now felt like a fortress, with patrol cars stationed at both ends and agents monitoring her every move. She tried to settle into her usual routine, but the weight of the situation was impossible to ignore. Even simple acts, making tea, reading a book, felt laden with tension. Her thoughts kept returning to the anonymous clerk who had risked everything and the growing list of people who saw her as a threat. As she sat on the couch, sipping her tea, her phone buzzed with a call from Greer. "General," he said, skipping the pleasantries. "I've been reviewing the latest threats. Some of these groups aren't just talking, they're planning. We need to be vigilant." "I know," Ford said, her voice steady. "But I won't live in fear. If I back down now, they win." Greer hesitated. "I admire your resolve, but I need you to promise me something. If things escalate, you'll let us handle it. No heroics. Let the professionals do their job." Ford smiled faintly. "I'm not in the habit of going rogue, Michael. I'll be careful." The next day brought another shocking development. As Ford prepared to leave for a speaking engagement at Howard University, her assistant Laura burst into her office. "Ma'am, you need to see this," Laura said, holding out a tablet. Ford took it, her eyes narrowing as she read the headline. Anonymous letter claims evidence of Ford's corruption. The article detailed a supposed whistleblower who claimed Ford had misappropriated military funds during her tenure as a commanding officer overseas. Ford's heart sank. The allegations were completely fabricated, but the timing was strategic. The goal was clear: to chip away at her credibility and distract from the real issues she was fighting for. "Who's behind this?" Ford asked, her voice cold. "We're still investigating," Laura replied. "But it's gaining traction fast. Some outlets are already picking it up without verifying the claims." Ford set the tablet down, her mind racing. "Contact Greer. I want a statement drafted immediately. And reach out to our allies in the media. They need to push back on this narrative before it gains more ground." Laura nodded and rushed out of the room, leaving Ford alone with her thoughts. She clenched her fists, anger bubbling just beneath the surface. The lies, the threats, the constant attacks. It was all designed to wear her down. But if her enemies thought she would crumble under the pressure, they didn't know her at all. That evening, as Ford stepped onto the stage at Howard University, the auditorium erupted into applause. The standing ovation lasted for minutes, a wave of support that seemed to lift the heavy burden she carried. She began her speech with a deep breath. "We are living in a time when truth and justice are under siege," she said, her voice carrying through the packed room. "But history has shown us that change is only possible when we refuse to be silenced." The audience hung on her every word as she spoke about her journey, the trial, and the ongoing fight for systemic reform. She didn't shy away from addressing the latest smear campaign, calling it out for what it was, a desperate attempt to distract from the truth. "I am not afraid of lies," she said, her tone defiant, "because lies cannot stand against the power of truth. And the truth is this: we will not stop fighting until justice is a reality for everyone, not just a privilege for a few." The crowd erupted in cheers, their energy filling the room like a tidal wave. Ford felt a renewed sense of purpose as she looked out at the sea of faces, each one a reminder of why she couldn't give up. But as she left the stage and headed backstage, her security detail closed in around her, their expressions tense. One of them, a young agent named Harris, stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low, "we've received word of a potential threat in the area. We need to get you out of here immediately." Ford nodded, her pulse quickening. She allowed them to escort her to the waiting SUV, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. As the vehicle pulled away from the university, she glanced out the window, her mind racing. The fight was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. But Ford knew one thing for certain. She wasn't done fighting, not by a long shot. The SUV sped through the dark streets of Washington, D.C., its tinted windows shielding General Alexandria Ford from the chaos outside. Her security team remained tense, their radios crackling with updates on the potential threat. Ford sat silently in the back seat, her mind racing as she tried to piece together the motives behind the latest attack on her integrity. The fabricated corruption claims were a low blow, even for her detractors. Whoever was orchestrating this campaign wasn't just trying to discredit her. They were trying to bury her. "Do we have any details about the threat?" Ford asked, breaking the silence. Agent Harris, seated in the passenger seat, turned to face her. "Not yet, ma'am. The intel is vague, but it mentioned possible retaliation for tonight's speech. We're heading to a secure location until we can confirm the situation." Ford frowned. "Retaliation? For what?" "Telling the truth." Harris's lips tightened. "For challenging the system, ma'am. That's enough to make you a target." Ford sighed, leaning back in her seat. She had faced danger before, but this felt different. This wasn't a battlefield. It was a minefield, with enemies lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The secure location turned out to be a safe house tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. The modest brick building was surrounded by a discreet but heavily armed team of agents. Ford stepped inside, her senses on high alert as Harris led her to a sparsely furnished living room. "We'll stay here until the threat level is downgraded," Harris said. "In the meantime, we've deployed additional surveillance to monitor your home and office." Ford nodded, her mind still preoccupied with the bigger picture. "And what about the media? Have they picked up on this yet?" Harris hesitated. "Not yet, ma'am, but it's only a matter of time." Ford sat down on the couch, her fingers drumming against the armrest. The constant barrage of attacks, first the trial, then the smear campaign, and now this, was beginning to wear on her. But she refused to let it show. Weakness wasn't an option. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking the silence. She picked it up and saw a message from Michael Greer. "Greer, we traced the corruption story to a PR firm tied to the police union. They're scrambling to cover their tracks. I'll update you in the morning." Ford's jaw tightened. The police union again. Their fingerprints were all over this mess, but proving it would be another uphill battle. She replied quickly, "Thanks for the update. Let's stay ahead of this." Hours passed, and the safe house remained quiet. Ford tried to rest, but sleep eluded her. She was just beginning to drift off when Harris knocked lightly on the door. "Ma'am, there's something you need to see," he said, his expression grim. Ford followed him to a small office where another agent was seated in front of a laptop. On the screen was a live feed from a security camera outside her home. A man in a hoodie was pacing near the gate, his movements erratic. In his hand, he clutched a bottle with a rag stuffed into its neck. Ford's stomach dropped. "Is that a Molotov cocktail?" Harris confirmed. "We intercepted him before he could throw it. He's in custody now." "Who is he?" Ford demanded. "And what does he want?" Harris exchanged a glance with the other agent. "He's refusing to talk, but we found messages on his phone linking him to an extremist group. They've been posting threats against you online for weeks." Ford's hands clenched into fists. The situation had officially escalated from character attacks to physical threats. Her enemies weren't just trying to discredit her. They were trying to silence her permanently. "What's our next move?" she asked, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. Harris straightened. "We'll be increasing your security detail and coordinating with local law enforcement to monitor any additional threats. This is a priority now." Ford nodded, her mind already racing ahead. This attack wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern. And if her enemies thought they could intimidate her, they were sorely mistaken. The next day, Ford returned to her office at the Pentagon, her resolve stronger than ever. Greer was already waiting for her, his briefcase open on the desk. "I'm guessing you heard about last night," Ford said, sinking into her chair. Greer nodded, his expression serious. "I did. I also heard the guy they caught is connected to the same PR firm we've been investigating." "It's all connected, Alex." Ford's eyes narrowed. "The police union, the PR firm, the extremist groups, they're working together." "It looks that way," Greer said. "And if we can prove it, we'll have a case that'll blow this thing wide open." Ford leaned forward, her voice low but determined. "Then let's prove it." Over the next several days, Ford's team worked tirelessly to uncover the truth. Greer coordinated with investigators to track the flow of money and communications between the police union and the PR firm. Meanwhile, Ford used her platform to speak out against the coordinated attacks, rallying public support and keeping the pressure on her enemies. The turning point came when a whistleblower, a former employee of the PR firm, came forward with damning evidence. In a televised interview, the whistleblower revealed emails, invoices, and internal memos that detailed a campaign to discredit Ford and other advocates for police reform. This wasn't just about silencing her, the whistleblower said. It was about sending a message to anyone who challenged the status quo. The revelation sent shockwaves through the nation. Protests erupted in cities across the country, with thousands calling for accountability and reform. The police union's leadership faced mounting scrutiny, and several high-ranking officials resigned in disgrace. But Ford wasn't finished. She knew that systemic change required more than public outrage. It required concrete action. As the dust began to settle, Ford stood on the steps of the Capitol, addressing a crowd of supporters and journalists. "This is not the end," she said, her voice carrying over the sea of faces. "This is the beginning of a movement that will demand accountability, transparency, and justice. We will not be silenced. We will not back down. And we will not stop until this country lives up to its promise of equality for all." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices a testament to the power of truth and resilience. Ford felt a surge of hope as she looked out at the sea of faces. The battle had been long and grueling, but it wasn't over. And as long as she had breath in her body, she would keep fighting for herself, for her community, and for the future. The momentum of General Ford's fight for justice had become a tidal wave, sweeping across the nation. The revelations from the whistleblower had sparked a federal investigation into the police union, and calls for widespread reform were louder than ever. But with victory came heightened risks. The threats against Ford and her allies escalated, forcing her to confront a grim reality. She was at the center of a battle far larger than she had anticipated. Late one night, Ford was at her desk in the Pentagon, reviewing intelligence briefs. Her office was quiet except for the faint hum of her desk lamp. The day had been relentless, filled with meetings and interviews, but her mind refused to rest. Her phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Greer. "Alex," he began, his voice low, "we got another problem." Ford leaned back, already bracing for bad news. "What now?" "We've uncovered a connection between the police union and a private contractor, Midland Security Solutions," Greer explained. "They've been funneling money to fund these smear campaigns, and more disturbingly, hiring operatives to intimidate whistleblowers and activists." Ford's stomach tightened. Midland Security Solutions was a shadowy company with a history of operating in ethically questionable gray areas. "What's their endgame?" she asked. "Control," Greer replied. "They want to quash the reform movement before it gains any more traction. And based on the intel we've gathered, you're still their primary target." Ford exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay calm. "Do we have enough to expose them?" "Not yet," Greer admitted. "But we're close. We've got a lead, a former Midland contractor willing to talk. He's agreed to meet, but only under strict conditions." "When and where?" Ford asked without hesitation. "Tomorrow night," Greer said. "But Alex, this is risky. Midland has eyes everywhere. If they catch wind of this meeting..." Ford cut him off. We don't have a choice, Michael. If this lead gets us closer to the truth, we have to take it. Greer sighed. All right, I'll set it up. The following evening, Ford's SUV pulled into an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The meeting place, Ford's security detail was on high alert, their eyes scanning every shadow for potential threats. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit, the air heavy with dust and the faint scent of rusted metal. At the center of the cavernous space stood a man in his early 40s, his face partially obscured by the hood of his sweatshirt. He shifted nervously as Ford approached, flanked by Greer and Agent Harris. "You're the general," the man said, his voice a mixture of awe and apprehension. "I am," Ford replied, her tone steady. "And you're the man with answers." The contractor hesitated before nodding. "Name's Ben Keller. I used to work for Midland, until I saw what they were really about." Ford studied him carefully. His hands trembled slightly, and his eyes darted around the room as if expecting someone to appear out of the shadows. "What do you have for us, Mr. Keller?" Ford asked. Keller reached into his bag and pulled out a laptop. "Everything," he said, setting it on the table. "Payment records, emails, contracts. Midland's been working with the police union for years, using dirty tactics to shut down anyone who threatens their power. And now, they're escalating." Ford leaned in as Keller opened a folder on the screen. The documents were damning. Proof of Midland's involvement in everything from smear campaigns to hiring operatives to intimidate and silence activists. "This is exactly what we need," Greer said, his voice taut with urgency. "But if Midland finds out you've shared this—" "They already know," Keller interrupted, his voice trembling. "I've been on the run for weeks. They'll kill me if they catch me." Ford straightened, her resolve hardening. "You're under our protection now, Mr. Keller. We'll make sure nothing happens to you." Before Keller could respond, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Ford's security detail sprang into action, their weapons drawn as they formed a protective circle around her. "Move! Now!" Harris barked, ushering Ford and Keller toward the exit. The next moments were a blur of chaos. Gunshots rang out, shattering the tense silence as figures in tactical gear stormed the warehouse. Ford's team returned fire, holding their ground as they shielded her and Keller. "Get them out of here!" Harris shouted, covering their retreat as the assailants closed in. Ford and Keller were rushed into a waiting vehicle, the tires screeching as the driver floored the accelerator. Keller was pale, his breathing ragged as he clutched the laptop to his chest. "They found us," he muttered, his voice shaky. "They found us?" Ford placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing, Ben. We'll protect you, and we'll expose them for what they are." The attack on the warehouse made national headlines the next morning. News outlets reported on the mysterious shootout, speculating about its connection to Ford's ongoing fight for justice. Meanwhile, Ford's team worked tirelessly to analyze the information Keller had provided. The evidence was irrefutable. Midland Security Solutions had not only funded the smear campaigns, but had also orchestrated a series of violent intimidation tactics aimed at silencing activists. Contracts linked directly to high-ranking officials within the police union, creating a trail of corruption that led to the highest levels of power. As Ford reviewed the files, her phone buzzed with a call from Secretary Jameson. "General," Jameson said, his tone urgent, "we've seen the intel Keller provided. This is bigger than we thought." "How big?" Ford asked. "Big enough to warrant a federal task force," Jameson replied. "The president's been briefed. He's authorized a full-scale investigation into Midland and the police union." Ford felt a surge of relief, tempered by the weight of what lay ahead. "What's our next move?" "We're taking this public," Jameson said. "A press conference is being arranged for tomorrow. You're going to stand with the DOJ, the FBI, and the administration to announce this investigation. The country needs to hear it from you." Ford nodded, her resolve unwavering. "I'll be ready." The next day, Ford stood on the steps of the Department of Justice, flanked by federal officials and members of her legal team. Cameras flashed as she approached the podium, the weight of the moment heavy on her shoulders. "Today," she began, her voice clear and steady, "we take another step toward justice. The evidence we've uncovered reveals a coordinated effort to undermine accountability and silence those who demand change. But let me be clear, we will not be intimidated. We will not be silenced. And we will not stop until those responsible are held accountable. The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers a powerful reminder of the movement she had inspired. As Ford stepped away from the podium, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight was far from over, but with each step forward, she was closer to the justice she sought, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been wronged. The announcement of the federal investigation sent shockwaves across the country. Overnight, Midland Security Solutions and its allies within the police union found themselves under intense scrutiny. Federal agents raided offices, seizing files and servers, while subpoenas were issued to high-ranking officials suspected of orchestrating the smear campaigns and violent tactics. The nation watched as the layers of corruption were peeled back, revealing a tangled web of greed, racism, and unchecked power. General Ford's name became synonymous with courage and resilience. Her leadership during the crisis made her a hero to many, but the heightened attention also made her a bigger target. The threats didn't stop. They evolved. Her team discovered encrypted messages in extremist online forums, with plans being discussed for coordinated attacks against her public appearances. The stakes had never been higher. Ford sat in her office late into the night, reviewing the latest security briefings with Michael Greer and Agent Harris. The room was quiet except for the occasional rustle of papers and the hum of her desk lamp. We've confirmed that several key figures in the police union have ties to Midland's intimidation efforts, Greer said, pointing to a dossier on the table. It's only a matter of time before indictments are handed down. Ford nodded, her expression unreadable. What about the whistleblower? Keller? Harris cleared his throat. He's in a secure location under federal protection. He's cooperating fully, but he's understandably nervous. Midland's operatives are still out there, and they'll stop at nothing to silence him. Ford leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Keller's evidence had been the linchpin in exposing Midland's operations, but the fight wasn't over yet. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. We need to stay ahead of them, Ford said finally. If they're desperate enough to target Keller, they won't hesitate to come after anyone else involved in this case, including me. Greer glanced at her, his brow furrowed. Alex, you've already put yourself in the crosshairs. Maybe it's time to pull back, let the DOJ and FBI handle this from here. Ford shook her head. I can't do that, Michael. This isn't just about me. It's about exposing the system that allowed this corruption to thrive. If I step back now, I'll be sending the wrong message. Harris hesitated before speaking. Then we need to increase your security detail, ma'am. From now on, every public appearance, every move you make will be under strict surveillance. Ford sighed, but she knew he was right. Do whatever you need to do. I won't stop fighting, but I'll follow your recommendations. The next morning, Ford arrived at the Pentagon to find her assistant, Laura, waiting with an urgent update. Ma'am, Laura began, her voice tight with concern. Midland just filed a countersuit against you. They're claiming defamation and abuse of power. Ford raised an eyebrow, unbothered by the news. Let them. Their own documents prove otherwise. This is nothing more than a distraction. It's more than that, Laura said. They're using it to flood the media with counter-narratives. They're trying to shift public opinion. Ford sighed, frustration flickering across her face. The countersuit was a transparent attempt to muddy the waters, but it was a tactic that had worked for Midland before. She couldn't afford to underestimate them. Contact Greer, Ford said. I want a statement drafted immediately. We're not going to let them control the narrative. The battle in the court of public opinion intensified. News outlets debated the countersuit, with some pundits questioning whether Ford's high-profile fight was creating more division than progress. Social media became a battleground, with supporters rallying under hashtags like #JusticeWithFord, while detractors pushed back with claims of a witch hunt. Ford remained steadfast, her focus on the larger mission. But the constant attacks began to take a toll. Late one night, she found herself sitting alone in her living room, staring at the envelope she had received from the young man at the courthouse weeks earlier. She hadn't opened it yet, but tonight, The weight of everything pushed her to finally see what it contained. She carefully unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was neat but shaky, and the words brought tears to her eyes. Dear General Ford, you don't know me, but I wanted to thank you for what you're doing. My son was killed in a traffic stop last year. He was unarmed, polite, and doing nothing wrong. But the officer said he felt threatened. No one believed us when we said it was wrong. No one cared. But now, because of you, people are listening. You're giving families like mine hope. Thank you for standing up. Thank you for fighting. Ford wiped at her eyes, her resolve strengthening. The letter was a reminder of why she was doing this. Not for herself, but for the countless families who had suffered in silence for far too long. The following week brought another explosive development. Federal investigators uncovered a hidden server in Midland's headquarters containing files labeled with code names. One file, titled Operation Silence, detailed plans to target whistleblowers and activists, with Ford's name listed at the top. The DOJ called a press conference to announce the findings. Ford stood alongside federal agents as they presented the damning evidence to the public. These documents confirm what we've suspected all along, the lead investigator said. Midland Security Solutions and its allies in the police union have been orchestrating a campaign of intimidation and violence. This is a direct attack on our democracy, and those responsible will face the full force of the law. As reporters shouted questions, Ford stepped forward, her voice calm but commanding. This fight isn't over. The individuals behind these operations believed they could act without consequences. They were wrong. We will not rest until justice is served, not just for those of us standing here today, but for every person who has suffered under their abuse of power. The press conference dominated headlines, sparking a wave of outrage and calls for accountability. Midland's leadership resigned en masse, and several officials within the police union were arrested. But Ford knew the fight wasn't finished. Later that evening, as Ford returned to the Pentagon, she received a call from Greer. Alex, he said, his tone urgent, we've just intercepted intel about a meeting between Midland's former executives and a high-ranking union official. They're planning something big. Ford's pulse quickened. What kind of meeting? We're not sure yet, Greer admitted. But we're working to pinpoint the location. If they're planning another attack, we need to stop it before it happens. Ford exhaled, her mind racing. The walls were closing in on Midland and the police union, but desperate people were often the most dangerous. Keep me updated, she said. Whatever they're planning, we'll be ready. As she hung up the phone, Ford stared out the window, her reflection gazing back at her in the glass. The stakes were higher than ever, but she wasn't afraid. The fight was far from over, and she was prepared to see it through to the end. The final blow came swiftly, a culmination of years of determination and relentless pursuit of justice. The federal task force, working tirelessly behind the scenes, had traced the covert meetings between Midland Security Solutions executives and high-ranking police union officials. The intel was precise, the operation carefully planned. The crackdown that followed was nothing short of a reckoning. Midland's leadership was arrested in a coordinated raid, their headquarters seized, and every piece of incriminating evidence laid bare for the world to see. The police union, once a powerful and untouchable entity, saw its leaders taken down one by one as investigations into corruption, bribery, and systemic abuse reached the highest levels. General Alexandria Ford stood at the forefront of the movement, her name forever etched in the history books as the woman who refused to back down. She wasn't just a hero in the eyes of the people. She was a symbol of resilience and unwavering commitment to justice. The story of how she brought down one of the most corrupt systems in the country was shared in classrooms, discussed in boardrooms, and written about in countless articles. She had achieved something extraordinary, but it hadn't come without sacrifice. In the months that followed, Ford continued to work on reform, helping draft new policies aimed at ensuring that the abuses of the past could never happen again. She became a leading voice in the movement for police accountability, speaking before Congress, advising on legislative changes, and serving as a mentor to young officers who shared her vision for a fairer, more just system. The investigation and the arrests of the corrupt officials had sent a message across the nation that no one, no matter how powerful, was above the law. For every life lost to systemic injustice, Ford had fought not just to hold the perpetrators accountable, but to ensure that their actions would never be repeated. Her phone rang one morning, the call marked with an unfamiliar number. It was President Reynolds on the line, his voice warm but serious. "General Ford, your work is far from over. We need your leadership more than ever. The changes you've helped put in motion are only the beginning, but they need someone like you to guide them through." Ford paused, staring out at the Washington skyline from her office. It was tempting to step back, to take the rest she'd earned, but she knew she couldn't stop now. "I'm ready, Mr. President," she said, her voice steady and resolute. "I won't stop until the work is done." The weight of everything she had accomplished, of everything still left to do, settled in her chest, but it was a weight she was ready to bear. The long road ahead was uncertain, and the challenges would never truly end. But she was no longer alone. She had built a coalition of advocates, allies, and citizens who would fight beside her, just as she had fought for them. In the quiet moments at home, when the demands of her role as a leader and public figure slowed to a gentle hum, Ford would occasionally find herself reflecting on the journey. The countless struggles, the battles fought both in courtrooms and in the streets, the sacrifices made, not just by her, but by so many others who had paved the way. She thought of the letter she had received from the young man at the courthouse, the words of gratitude that had given her renewed strength when she needed it most. And she thought of the families, the people, the communities who had suffered in silence for far too long, finally seeing the change they had longed for. Ford had stood firm in the face of corruption, never wavering, never backing down. And in the end, she knew that her work wasn't just about dismantling a broken system. It was about building something new, something better. A future where justice wasn't just a word, but a reality for every person, every family, every community. And with that knowledge, she found peace. The fight wasn't over, but she was ready. Always ready.